All right. Okay, sorry about the delayed start. We're now ready to go. We will run 10 minutes on, and we've got a fairly civilized timetable today, so I think we can just add on at the end. So now we've got Christian Barry from the ANU talking about threats, bystanders, and obstructors. So, Christian.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking a bit about the first part of Helen's book, which is really very interesting and sort of foundational work in self-defense, on which a lot of the rest of the book is built in the second half. So Helen's interest is in coming up with an account of permissible killing, and she entertains two broad types of justification for permissible killing. Broad justifications for killing that can make it permissible. One is that the person who is killed constitutes a threat of some kind to the prospective victim. And then the second is that you can give some sort of lesser evil justification for the killing. I'm going to be focusing really exclusively on the first question about constituting a threat. Now, another thing that's kind of interesting in Helen's work is that she is interested in the way in which two types of factors about an agent can make it more or less permissible or not to kill them, and more or less wrongful to kill them. One factor, which has to do with their being threatening, I'm just going to refer to as there being a contributing agent. Right? So contribution is one characteristic that can make a difference to whether or not you could permissibly kill someone. And then a second characteristic, which is sometimes called responsibility, I'm just going to call culpability. That is the degree to which an agent can be said to be culpable for the threat that they now face. Okay, and these things interact, as I understand it, in the following way in Helen's view. So one is that she makes an innovative change to the way in which we conceive of those who fall under the category of a threat, and moves some people who are traditionally thought as being bystanders into the category of threat. I'll explain that in a moment. And then she also distinguishes between two different types of threats, direct and indirect threats, and she takes this to be a morally significant difference. So she puts a significant amount of moral weight on the difference between being a threat or being a contributor or not, and then a significant amount of weight on the different manner in which an agent may contribute to a threat. She talks some, but a bit less about what I'm calling culpability, but I'll discuss that. Okay, so this is my key to all philosophical mythology, and so I'm just going to try to spell out her notions as I sort of understand them in terms of a very simple case that I'm going to refer back to in putting some pressure on some of the things that Helen says in the book. So here we have a cart. We have a fellow named Dirk, named after the fact that he's a prospective doer of harm. And he is, in Helen's sense, a direct threat in the sense that he's sort of pushing this cart. And there's at least one possibility of how things unfold in this situation, whereby this cart smashes into Vicky for victim down at the bottom. Okay? So he's a direct threat. There is Alice, and now Alice, for Alice the Allower, is actually, in Helen's sense, a true bystander, right? Because she is not a direct threat to Vicky, nor is she an indirect threat, right? She is merely an agent, as I'm understanding her here, who is in a position to prevent the cart coming down the hill by interposing a box.
A square.
So this is the limitations of the medium. My daughter's kindergarten thing, they did a survey for Father's Day, and one of the questions was, my dad is so strong he can, and then she answered, lift tiny boxes. So here's Alice's tiny box, which can prevent the cart from coming down. This is Ella, who's a potential enabler. Now, Ella's an enabler because here's something which, even after Dirk pushes the cart, will stop it if she does nothing. But she can be an enabler in the sense that she can remove this obstacle to the harm that would befall Vicky. And here is Ollie for the obstructor. And Ollie is the obstructor because we are to imagine that there's this sort of a tunnel, so Vicky can't escape any way from the threat of this falling object except up this tunnel. And we're imagining Ollie is sort of sitting there in the tunnel. Okay? Okay, so in Helen's terminology, Alice is the only one of these who is not a threat at all. I take it Dirk is the only direct threat, whereas Ella and Ollie seem to me to be indirect threats. Right? She doesn't really discuss all that much this category of Ella, the enabler, and we can discuss about what role that plays in this taxonomy, and partly her view on that will also influence whether or not she takes there to be a really morally significant difference between direct and indirect threats, because it may be that Ella looks more like Dirk in terms of moral significance and more like Ollie, and that may have some influence on how we evaluate the general claims about direct and indirect threats. Okay, so now the general picture that she develops is that permissible killing of, and this gets back to the combination, these characteristics of these agents I've sketched just so far all have to do with the fact of whether they're contributors or not. 4 of them are contributors. I'm sorry, 3 of them are contributors, and 1 of them is not a contributor in Helen's sense. They're threats. One's not a threat. But I haven't talked about culpability, right, or responsibility. So one of the interesting things about Helen's view is she thinks that direct threats don't need to be culpable at all for it to be permissible to kill them in self-defense. So Dirk could be completely innocent. We could imagine, how could Dirk be innocent? Well, Dirk could be innocent because maybe Dirk is just being blown by a gust of wind into the cart and he sort of stumbles into it and knocks it down. He could be innocent because his whole life he's been pushing carts harmlessly down hills that perform some important social function within the society. There are all kinds of reasons why he might be non-culpably unaware of the fact that in this case he's posing a threat to Vicky. Okay? But for Helen, this is a special category because no culpability or responsibility is really required for it to be permissible to kill Dirk in self-defense. And she wants to say that Ollie, on the other hand, that is not true. So Ollie, it is not the case that Ollie, if Ollie is non-culpable, if Ollie is just harmlessly, as he's always wants to do, sitting down and having his sandwich at the end of the pipe, from which that she can't justifiably kill Ollie as a means of escaping the threat from Vicky. And Ella, again, there's not that much discussion, but I'm kind of assuming that she thinks that Ella too, that unless Ella is culpable, if she just happens to come along and remove this, that Vicky can't kill Ella to prevent her from removing this thing which will block this. But I'll be interested to hear what Helen has to say because that's a different category. Okay, so, and then Alice. Now, Alice is a true bystander, unlike faux bystanders like Ollie, right? Ollie's a faux bystander because Ollie actually is a threat, although an indirect one, because as she defines threats, or as what I'm describing contributors, her presence, movements, make it the case that Vicky is sort of under threat. They remove an option for escape from her. Okay, so one of the interesting categories then that's left is the bystander, sort of the real bona fide bystander for Helen. And she wants to say that these people can only really be killed as part of sort of a lesser evil justification. At least that's what my understanding is. And she actually has some very strong things to say about the sense in which, if there's any sense in which, we could say that Alice can be responsible for the threat under which Vicky finds herself. She thinks that it's actually incoherent to view Alice as responsible for the threat that Vicky is under. And I'll read you just a couple of quick passages. She says, I suggest that properly understood in the sense that it's the narrow reading of bystander rather than the broader understanding of bystander that would include Ollie. The idea of a responsible bystander is not only unattractive, but conceptually incoherent. She says, it doesn't consist in the fact that they are not to be blamed for what they are doing or where they are with an innocent threat. They're innocent because they're not doing anything with respect to the threat to victim for which blame would be appropriate. Thus, there is nothing with respect to the threat to victim for which bystander can be morally responsible. Right? It makes no sense to ask about their innocence or responsibility with respect to what threatens victim. Okay, so here's what I want to do. One is I want to challenge the claims that Helen makes about bystanders. So I want to say that there can be culpable bystanders of whom it can reasonably be said that they are responsible in some important sense for the threat, and that consequently that they can actually be permissibly killed potentially permissibly killed without appealing to a lesser evil justification. So if you want to think of it in terms of liability, they can make themselves liable to be killed through their culpable omissions. Okay, so that's one point I want to make. The second thing I want to ask is, I want to put a little bit of pressure on the idea that so much more weight should be borne on the distinction between direct and indirect threats. That is one of the things I think that Helen does that's really interesting, is to show how these rather disparate characters of Dirk, Ella, and Ollie can all fall under the umbrella of this broad definition of a threat. And given that they share that feature, of features that clearly Alice doesn't have, I think we need a bit more of a rich theory of why we should take that distinction seriously. In Helen's book, she appeals to the distinction between, if things unfold in this way, it will only be true of one person that they will have killed Vicky, and that's Dirk, whereas the others won't. And there's a significant difference between killing and, I guess, leading to someone's death. But I think we kind of need a little bit more of a theory. And I'm going to suggest, in the time-worn tradition of today's talks, I'm going to suggest a way she might go forward, drawing on some ideas of my own, or ideas I've developed with Gerhard Overland. And then I'm also going to, I think it is going to put a little bit of pressure on treating all direct threats at similar levels of culpability as morally on a par, which I think seems to be the sort of view, and I guess say some things that are more friendly to the kind of view that Jeff has offered, according to which we would distinguish between direct threats depending on various other factors of the situation, independent of their culpability. Right? Okay. So, let me just start with the bystander. To say, now I think that one difference between bystanders and contributors is that bystanders always pretty much usually start out as innocent. They only become culpable when the situation becomes transparent to them. Now, in this case, I'm imagining that Alice becomes aware of the situation. She becomes aware of the fact that Ella's about to pull this out, that Dirk has pushed this, that Ollie is blocking the path, and it doesn't matter the relative culpability or anything of these people for now from her point of view. All that she knows is that this is what's going to happen. Okay? Now, then the question is, what could make Alice culpable with respect to the threat, which is this cart coming down to Vicky? Well, she can become culpable if it's the case that the cost to her of assisting by preventing this is below a certain threshold. Now, I think that initially, one thing that I think is very plausible, that's definitely Helen's view, is that if we think of these people, if they have done their relevant actions and now puts Vicky under threat, that there are different levels of cost that they should be willing to take on to prevent the threat from maturing into the harm to Vicky. So if Dirk, knocks into this cart and then becomes aware of it, he has a duty to take on more cost to himself, if he can, to prevent the cart from hitting Vicky than Ollie has to take on, right? So, and also, I think, probably Ella, right? So the idea is that, and initially, that Alice, who's the allower, since she hasn't set the thing in motion, the cost that she has to take on to prevent it is much less still. So I think that the initial cost that the agents are required to bear in order to prevent the harm start out at different levels. Nevertheless, unless we are skeptics about there being any duties to assist others, which I don't think Helen is, and I don't think we should be, there is at least some cost, some non-negligible cost that we should think that Alice is obliged to take on in order to prevent the threat to Vicky. Let's say that, since Vicky's life is at stake, that Alice has, she at least has to be able to suffer sort of a broken hand to save Vicky's life. That's a pretty low threshold. I think many people might say that she might be required to take on a little bit more cost. Let's just set it there. Now, to what extent Alice is culpable? Well, first of all, the question is, can she do it? Can she prevent this from happening at a cost that is at or below the cost that is required of her by her duty to assist, namely, no greater than a broken hand? Right? If it's greater than a broken hand, then she's not obliged to take on this cost. Right? She still might be the good thing to do, but at least she hasn't failed in some obligation to Vicky. So if she'll suffer a severed leg and she refrains from doing it, then she has allowed the harm to occur, but she hasn't culpably allowed it because the cost that would have been required of her to prevent it is higher than the cost that she was required to bear. So far, so clear? Okay. But if it's a broken hand or less, and again, we're in the ideal world where everything is transparent to her, then if she fails to take on that cost, then she will be culpable with respect to what happens to Vicky. And I think here, too, we can distinguish between, and so then we have to ask is, so suppose that Alice is culpable, what can Vicky do? What justifications are available to Vicky in terms of what she can do to prevent herself from being harmed? And here I think there are a lot of important things that we need to know about Alice, about what's going on in Alice's head. Because there are a lot of different things that might be going on with Alice that could, and with the situation, that can make a difference to the degree to which Vicky could permissibly harm her. So one thing is, one type of allower is, so we could imagine that she's actually a controller, that she actually wants Vicky to be harmed, and that she's sort of shown up on the scene, and she, although she's in this situation of allowing now, she would have been, if Dirk had sort of failed, she would have gone up and pushed the cart herself, right? So she's disposed to harm Vicky. She's sort of controlling for the harm. She's making it more probable that Vicky will be harmed, although she herself is not now doing anything. She's not now. And there's an interesting question about whether or not she would fall in that interpretation under the category of threat or not. I don't think she counts as a threat as Helen defines it, but there's one sense in which you might sort of view her as a threat if she is disposed to become a threat in some counterfactual, that is not the actual situation. So that's a case where Alice is sort of controlling for it. Then another case just where she's not controlling for it. She doesn't really care. She certainly wouldn't harm it, but she just doesn't care. And maybe she doesn't like Vicky, and she's just happy just sitting there sipping her tea, and she just can't be bothered. Okay? So she's then culpable. And I think one other thing that would determine her culpable, aside from level of awareness, we're assuming the situation is transparent, is the actual cost that she would have to take on to prevent it. Right? So if the cost that could be required of her to prevent this harm is to suffer a broken hand, and she would have to suffer a broken hand, then at least her failure, it's kind of pretty close to where the cost that she would actually have to take on. Now, she's still culpable, but we might think that there's an intuitive difference between that case of Alice and a case where she really almost has to do nothing, right? She's sitting there, and all she has to do is flick a little switch. If she flicks a little switch, the box will go off, and it will block the cart. The box itself is not important to her. It doesn't cost her anything, so she's taking on almost no cost, as small a cost as you can imagine. And there it seems quite culpable because, well, it's not just that she's falling sort of below, but it seems to make a difference that it's sort of falling so far below what she could actually be required to do. Okay, so I think that there's a clear sense in which if the situation unfolds and Alice can intervene at no cost to prevent this from happening and doesn't do so, and as a result, Vicky gets killed, there is a very important way in which Alice can be said to be responsible for what threatens Vicky. How is she responsible? She's responsible because it's her failure to have done what she was obliged to do that explains why Vicky is now under threat. It's not the only thing, right? And again, I think it's perfectly consistent with saying that she is responsible to saying that the others may bear responsibility if they do nothing, but she too is a responsible agent. And in a case where there are no other agents, she may be the sole responsible agent. If this cart just happens to be blown by some wind down the hill, and there are no other agents here except Ollie, or we can imagine it's just type of escape is just blocked, so there's no way out. It's only up to Alice. Then she may be the sole responsible agent. So the next question is, so I think that certainly to the degree to which we think that Vicky could redirect the threat in some way or impose some cost either by using Alice as a means to block it or as a side effect of preventing the thing from hurting her. The first thing is, what kind of cost could she impose on Alice? And second, what kind of justification would she give for that? And I think that it's pretty clear that the types of justification she could give for harming culpable Alice would be a liability type justification, not a lesser evil type justification. I don't think it would be a regrettable infringement of Alice's rights if Vicky imposed a broken hand on her as a means of preventing herself from being hit by the cart. Okay. But then there's the next question, which is, well, but after all, Helen is interested in killing. Could it ever be the case that Vicky could actually kill Alice? And here, too, I think it really depends, but I think that if Vicky is in no way responsible for where she is, the cart is going towards her, Alice can stop it at no cost, and she just decides not to. I think it's plausible that Vicky could kill Alice as a side effect of saving herself from the cart in this case. Right? I'm not sure she could use her opportunistically to block the threat, but I think as a side effect, it could be permissible. Now, of course, rarely we don't have information. Even small mitigation in the culpability of the agent when the agent is an allower, I think makes a very big difference in a way in which it doesn't make as big a difference when someone is a direct threat. Right? So in that sense, I think that the culpability component becomes extremely important when contribution is absent in a way that it may not be as important when contribution is present. Nevertheless, the culpability component, if it's there in abundance, can be sufficient. And in fact, I also think that if we think of all these characters and we make these three completely innocent and this one very culpable, that the culpability can even drown out the contributions of the others. So I think that if Dirk is really completely innocent in terms of this cart, maybe it's his job to send the cart down, it's just a freak accident that some horrible person has put Vicky there, right? And there's no responsibility of either of these other characters, but Alice is the one, and the situation is transparent. And Vicky has a choice of distributing harm across these agents. It seems to me that the culpability of Alice in this case drowns out the contributions of the others. Right? Okay, so this is kind of interesting also because I think that it brings up an interesting feature of Helen's view, which is that culpability seems to be something that is sort of obviously scalar, right? That we can be more or less culpable with respect to. And it'll vary along various different axes in terms of an agent's level of awareness, what they should have known, the cost to them of refraining, and so on and so forth, right? Whereas these other notions about sort of being a contributor or not, well, that's sort of just a binary distinction. And then even within the category of threats, of contributors, there are these big distinctions that seem to make a significant difference. And I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that there still is a difference between these, but I guess I'm much more sympathetic to a view. I guess it's not Otsuka's view as such, but a view that the culpability component is a really, really, really important issue when it comes to permissible killing, even when it comes to allowers, and that they can be killed in that way. Okay. Okay, the second thing is with respect to direct and indirect threats. And here again, I think, let's just start with comparing Ella and Dirk. So one thing that is a little bit odd, at least, is that, so Ella, actually just do Ollie and Dirk. Let's say that, so Ollie and Dirk are both causally responsible for the threat that Vicky will be killed. And on Helen's view, we don't need any responsibility whatsoever on Dirk, whereas we do need it on Ollie. Right? But then, one thing that seems a bit odd is that it does strike me that if we even have the tiniest amount of responsibility on Ollie, then it can shift pretty dramatically if we can distribute harm between Dirk and Ollie, how we do it. So if Dirk is fully innocent and is an innocent direct threat, and Ollie is just sort of a negligent indirect threat, what do we think about that sort of case? I mean, it's not obvious to me, but it seems that even just a little bit, relatively mild culpability. This is, by the way, not understanding responsibility in Helen's sense, in that as she defines responsibility, it has to be sort of an intentional failure. Whereas I think David Mabel pointed this out yesterday. Certainly, we could broaden the category to say that even a non-intentional failure to sort of take adequate account of the facts could certainly make an agent in some sense culpable. So at the very least, even if we think there is a difference between these, it does seem that you can rather huge jumps very quickly with even minimal culpability of these indirect threats relative to direct threats. That's not necessarily an objection, but at least it makes it unclear how important of a distinction it is. And if we imagine that the direct threat is just a little bit negligent, but this person is just like really, they could very easily have gotten out of the way and they didn't. Again, it seems obvious that this person could be liable, can be more justifiably killed than the direct threat. So I think the difference between these categories may not be as sort of broad. Okay, so then what could explain the difference between these? Well, the way Helen describes, she sort of appeals to the idea that Dirk will be a killer and Ella and Ollie will not be. And she acknowledges that there may be some cases where our notion of what it is to kill is a bit fuzzy around the edges, but there does seem to be an important, straightforward sense in which Dirk, the doer of harm, kills Vicky in a way that Ella, by removing the obstacle, either allows her to be killed. That's the way in which Philippa Foot would understanding it, because you're removing an obstacle to harm, which is a kind of act of allowing in Foot's sense. And Ollie, again, is sort of is not the killer of Vicky. But again, given that they are causally involved, and the fact that we can call one a killing and one not, it's not obvious to me that that counts as a justification. I think that we would want some sort of underlying, some theory about what's different about these different types of contribution that make us want to treat one as a killing, which is a sort of a decision, is a sort of an evaluative decision about how we're going to treat it, not somehow just a merely descriptive one, because I think that our deciding to call it a killing is because we sort of see that this particular type of form of relation has a certain kind of significance. Okay, so I think, one way we might go is to say, well, all of these people who are threats, as opposed to Alice, have that in common, right? They are causally responsible. I mean, some people want to say that if Alice does nothing, she's causally responsible, but let's just put that to the side for now. They're causally responsible in a clear way in which Alice is not for the threat that Vicky's faced. And then we have to say, well, why should different modalities of causal relevance make a difference to the permissibility of harming these people? Okay? Well, especially if they're all innocent, right? If they're all innocent, then they're just causing it, but they haven't done anything wrong, right? Why is it that three people who are doing nothing wrong, but one of whom just happens, through no fault of their own, to have a particular kind of causal relevance to what's about to befall a victim, is somehow you can permissibly kill them, whereas the others you can't permissibly kill? What is the magic in that kind of different kind of causal relation that would make that possible? So one proposal might be is the idea that with respect to all those who are causally relevant to a harm, even if they are innocent, it still makes a difference how hard it would be to control for causing harms in this way. Right? So we're imagining these people are innocent, so they've either taken all the precautions necessary that would be required, or they've just, something's happened to them by accident. So in one sense, they've tried to control. They've controlled for the types of costs that their conduct might give rise to a sufficient degree for their situation. But we still might think that there are additional things they could do, or they might possibly do, to check, to avert, to limit the threat. And one thought might be that, well, people like Dirk, whenever you're pushing a heavy object, at least if it's a voluntary action, right? If it's not just being sort of blown into it, if he's voluntarily pushing, you know that even if you check and everything, this is sort of a characteristic risk that's associated with this. And it's something that seems to be a little bit more, you might be more able to control for than controlling for the fact that removing something in a field might make it the case that sometime down the line, that thing might be useful in blocking some other threat, right? I mean, this is a very crude example, but the idea might be, we're sitting here. How would I know that I've checked adequately enough completely, or if I've exhaustively checked whether or not I might be an obstacle to someone escaping a threat? It may be that our ability to control for being an obstacle in that way is more limited than our ability to control for becoming a prospective doer of harm by sort of initiating some causal sequence. These are contingent differences, but they're pretty robust differences between these modalities of contribution that we're imagining this is just an ordinary box, an ordinary thing that happens to be there that Ella's picking up, not that it has any particular, she has any reason to suspect that it's doing that. So, we don't normally worry about all the different ways in which my removing this might make it the case that some harm will befall someone as a result of my removing it that might not otherwise have happened, right? Whereas, when I push it, it's pretty easy to see what the possible sort of consequences might be, right? So it's sort of an odd thing, because in all cases we're saying that they've done enough to check, but you might think that there's still further things that you might do in addition to what you're required to do to check on some things, easier than it would be on others. And the reason that might be relevant is that we don't want to live our lives in a way where we're constantly worrying about every single aspect of our behavior, about how it might be causally relevant to harm. But it's relatively easy to check how certain of our behavior might become causally relevant to harm, like when we're pushing things, when we're moving big objects around, that kind of stuff. So this is also, I think, relevant, and one thing that might sort of give ground the intuition that this might be at work would be the kind of contrast that I think Jeff draws attention to between somebody who harms another in a direct way, but through a very, very, very unlikely causal chain, and somebody who harms another directly through a less wild, unlikely causal chain. So the case of the conscientious driver who takes the permissible risk of driving, right? But he's a conscientious driver, so we're imagining it as justified, but nevertheless, his vehicle ends up swerving and he's going towards the victim, okay? And the person who picks up and lo and behold, his cell phone has been wired in such a strange way that when he makes a call, some electrical charge goes to the circuitry and ends up killing somebody, right? And again, it seems to me that if we think of it in terms of this sort of puzzle, if the situation became transparent to these two people, the driver or the cell phone operator, what cost would they be required to take on to prevent the harm from befalling victim? It seems to me that the driver intuitively would have to take on more cost to prevent the harm than the cell phone person. Now, in both cases, they're acting permissibly. They're innocent. Nevertheless, there's a sense in which driving a car, there are certain characteristic risks. It's still justified by the fact that there are certain benefits and so on. But nevertheless, there's sort of a recognizable risk, and we can control for that risk in a way that simply dialing cell phones, I mean, it's such an unlikely causal chain. We have such a, the more bizarre the connection between our conduct and an agent, the more difficult it is to imagine some possible way in which the agent could have known, independently of whether or not they've done enough to make it the case that they're not culpable. Right? So that would be a way of sort of intuitively showing that even within the category of direct threats, your ability to control can make a difference to your duty to take on cost to prevent it later, and correspondingly, or at least I think correspondingly, the permissibility of imposing cost on you to avert the threat. And that might be a way of grounding something like this distinction between direct and indirect threats. Let's see. Okay, so I think I'm going to just stay there and just end by saying how much I really admired Helen's book and the work, and how admirably it puts together sort of individual morality and these broader questions. It's a real model for us all, I think. Thank you.
You guys sit relatively close together.
Okay.
Yep. Christian, if you just come a little bit further forward. Just shift to your chair so you're level with each other. Otherwise, you're going to look really small. Okay. Right.
Oh, great. Thanks very much, Christian. I really, really enjoyed that. Yeah, and I think actually this is something that I need to really just go away and think more about, because partly because I don't think at all about the enabling people, so they just don't crop up at all in the taxonomy that I draw, and they obviously should. So one of the things, so just sort of thinking about this now, one of the things we should notice about Ella is that until she moves the box, victim's not in danger, it's Vicky. So it's Ella's action that makes it the case that Vicky's life is at risk. And so I think that's going to be a relevant feature that makes her more on the sort of the direct threat side, because she's not someone who's sort of where there's it's because the threat of Vicky only arises if Ella acts with the box. Before that, Vicky's fine, right? There's just no danger. So in cases like this, it can look like it's set up that somebody's in danger because it looks like the trolley's heading toward, but actually as things are, Vicky's fine. So that's one of the things I think that we should think about in this case. But in terms of what this means for prospective liability and so on, I just need to think more about that. So I really like the way that you've kind of set this up. So Alice, right? So I mean, I agree with you that people who fail to rescue can render themselves liable. I think I disagree with you about whether they can become liable to lethal harm. So I think it matters that she's failing to save rather than endangering. So she can make Vicky better off by her presence, but if she weren't there, Vicky would be dying anyway. And I think that these things matter. So I agree that she can be liable to some harm, but I don't have a situation that we could kill her. Maybe this is so. You said that maybe she could at least be liable to be killed as a side effect. And one of the things I'm not sure about is whether when it comes to people who are liable, these distinctions that we've been talking about opportunistic and eliminative agency, killing as a side effect, whether those differences matter when it comes to liable harm. So I tend to think that when someone's liable to be killed, they're liable to be killed in any way, right? So opportunistic killing and so on. And so if that's true, then you're making it sound like, look, she's only liable to the kind of the nicest kind of killing, right? Whereas it seems to me like if she's liable, then she'd even be liable to be killed opportunistically, and unless you're gonna sort of sign up to the view that actually liable people can be liable just to a certain type of killing and not to other types of killing, it looks like you'll have to say as well that she's. Some people hold that view, but I don't think that view's right. And then you're going to say, look, she could be liable to be used as a shield or something like that. And I wonder whether you want to go down that line. Yeah. So the controlling Alice case as well. That's so where she would have gone and shut the trolley if Dirk hadn't done it. I mean, I think these are interesting cases. So Victor has some interesting thoughts about this, about kind of whether she would have valued the opportunity to avoid incurring liability. And so we might think there's something in those lines that, given that it's true in the actual case that she wouldn't have valued the opportunity to avoid becoming liable, she wouldn't have taken it, that maybe we can treat her differently to somebody who would have taken that opportunity had it been there. So I think maybe I might want to say something along those lines, that can help explain the thought that she might be liable, because it's not just sort of counterfactual, it's true in the actual case that she would have been willing to push the trolley if Dirk hadn't done it. And just briefly on the direct and indirect threat stuff, yeah, I think this is a really good point. It's one of the parts of the books that I've been least happy with, and this is something I've been working on for a really long time, and I still don't quite know how to, the best way to try and motivate a distinction, which I think intuitively, like, we can see that there are these different kinds of contributions. I also think most people's intuitions do reflect that they're morally significant in some ways. Killing is different in some ways to making other kinds of contributions, but it's really hard to explain exactly why it is. And this is something where, I don't have much better to say than I say in the book, but I think you're absolutely right that better things need to be said about this question.
That makes two of us.
Okay, so I might just take the last list and go in reverse order. Well,
can I make one tiny little point before?
Yeah, sure. Shall I take? It's actually not want to go this time. I'm so Christian, George. Everyone else, keep your hands up.
It was just about the Ella Ollie contrast, where you're saying that there's a sense in which until she removes the rock, that
It's not
victim's
a danger.
not a danger. And there's a sense in which we could say that could be true at least of one way of Ollie. If Ollie's not yet in position, before Ollie becomes an obstructor, Vicky's not in danger.
No, I think that's false, because I think there's still something she has to get away from.
She has to get away from, okay.
Yeah, there's still something she has to escape from, yeah. That's one of the differences between,
So Victor was quite short last time, so Victor.
Oh, you get reward for good behaviour.
Christian, you had the culpability makes a difference, and I think everyone's going to agree that it does, but I wondered why you thought it made a difference. And then you also thought that the disposition to do the same thing makes a difference. And I wondered whether the disposition makes a difference independently of culpability, or only because the person's culpable in virtue of being culpable, they have the disposition. So you can imagine that Alice isn't culpable, but if Dirk hadn't been there, then imagine that she isn't culpable because she feels sorry for Vicky because Vicky's being attacked by Dirk. But had Dirk not been there, then she would have hated Dirk and not felt sorry for him and pushed the trolley. So she has the relevant disposition, but she doesn't have culpability yet. So I wanted to know what matters in this case. Does what matter the disposition, or culpability and disposition? I suspect it's culpability and disposition that you want here. Just the mere disposition isn't enough. But you had it as it was the disposition that was the vital thing.
Yeah, I think that seems right to me intuitively, that you would need the two.
Sure. All right.
Thanks.
Ian.
So, I want to make sure I understood this correctly, but I thought you said that we shouldn't distinguish between different types of killing when someone's liable to killing. That opportunistic.
Right, so I'm not super sure about this, but it seems to me that if somebody makes themselves liable to be killed, they're liable to even opportunistic killing and deliberative killing and side effect.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right to me, because it seems to me like one of the main characteristics in error proportionality is defining, hashing out liability in terms of who can do the harm and how they can do it, and it seems like it makes perfect sense, just like it makes sense to say that it's proportionate to punch someone, but it's not proportionate to kill them. It makes perfect sense to say it's proportionate to eliminatively kill them, but not to opportunistically kill them, or make those types of distinctions. I don't understand why you would resist that. It seems like one is clearly a worse harm than the other.
So that's so they're liable to be killed, and in all the cases you're killing them. And I want to sort of so I think there's a tension here, because when it comes to innocent people, I want to say that you're doing something worse. But I guess my thought is that when somebody renders themselves liable to be killed, they render themselves liable to opportunistic killing. I can't think of cases in which I think that someone merely rendered themselves liable to side effect killing, right? If what you've done is bad enough to forfeit your right not to be killed, I don't think that it could be that you're not liable to be opportunistically killed. I mean, other people disagree with this, but my thought is just that, when you forfeit your right not to be killed, you're liable to the worst sort, which entails that you're going to be liable to the nicer sort. But I think other people share your worry about it.
So just following the intuitions here, right? So if there is this case of culpable Alice, right? So now we, a third party, arrive on the scene, but we have no way of directly preventing Vicky from being harmed. But we can do something. We can imagine that we can jettison some object that will block it, but we also realize that as a side effect it will kill Alice. I suspect that is going to look different than the idea where we can actually use Alice as a shield. Now again, that's just an intuition, but it does seem to be, in that kind of case, a pretty significant, a pretty pushy one to me.
It just doesn't to me. I think if she's forfeited her right not to be killed, then it doesn't matter.
Okay, Kim?
Oh, I got on the queue immediately. Fantastic. So it was a favor on it. So, Helen, I think the only question is going to be what you're going to want to do with your combo justifications, where you have an innocent threat, where you put in a dash of Todorosian duty combined with a lesser evils justification. And anytime you do that, you are going to have a distinction between eliminative and opportunistic killing, right? Because you might think that the person is sufficiently liable to eliminate the threat in the innocent threat case without being able to be opportunistically killed.
Right.
Because you're gonna think that there's a difference in terms of whether you can use lesser evils justification for opportunistic killing,
Right.
and you're combining.
But I don't think the innocent threat's liable to be killed, right? So I reserve liability for cases in which somebody's forfeited their rights, and I think this person has a duty in this case to suffer some harm. But I don't think they're liable in the sense of having forfeited their rights to behave in a particular way.
I just think that a lot of people's intuitions are going to come from the innocent threat sorts of cases, where you think that you're allowed to kill them at the end of the day, and that's because there are two different justifications going on for you. I don't think we're disagreeing. I don't think we're disagreeing in a way. Right? You're going to deny that the innocent threat cases can be used opportunistically.
Yeah.
Robo.
All right. So even if we add the enabler category that Christian suggested, I'm still questioning whether your taxonomy of threat is exhaustive. And what I particularly have in mind is Jonathan Perry's recent work that he's doing with what he's calling moral causation. So imagine an adaptive case that he set up, where we have the 4 on the main track, you're on the side track. We stipulate that 5 on the main track is enough to obligate the switch operator to switch to the sidetrack you're on, and I really want you dead because you're perdition driving the wrong side of the road. So I leap. That was a joke, by the way. I'm not serious. So I go ahead and I leap onto the main track, make it obligating, on your view at least, the switch operator to aim the train or trolley at you. In that case, I would want to say that I am a direct threat to you, that you could kill me eliminatively and the threat would go away. But it doesn't look like I'm standing in any sort of brute physical causal relationship to you in a way that we've sort of outlined. It seems like a category of threat that's wholly outside of this framework, but it seems like I want to say that what I'm doing is threatening.
So I think we need to unpack that a little bit. So I don't think you can do that, what Jonathan is apparently calling moral causation of if you jump onto the track, you can't make it obligatory for the person to divert. Just because you're making it 5 now, I think you kind of just waive your right not to be killed when you jump on the track. I don't think you get to sort of jump on the track and add your moral weight, because you just... The one on the side track, if there's a lesser evil justification for killing the one on the side track, it's because it was the only way of avoiding harm to a sufficient number of people. But in this case, that's not true now, because you had other ways of avoiding harm to yourself. So this is no longer a case in which we have to kill the one because there's an unavoidable harm otherwise that would befall 5 people. It was only unavoidable for 4, and if we need it to be unavoidable harm for 5 people, it won't be enough because for you it wasn't unavoidable. So I don't think you can do this kind of making it obligatory. Now we could have, so we might vary the case where we say something like, look, say Christian is the guy who can switch the tracks. He doesn't quite have a clear view, so he can't see how many people on the track. He's not sure. So as he leans down to get his binoculars, right, you get onto the track, and then he thinks that there's 5. He doesn't know that you've done it deliberately. Then I think it could be permissible for me to kill you. So then he sees that you're already dead, and then he thinks, well, now I can't save 5 people, so now it's impermissible because one of them's already dead. So I think you would be liable. So I do think if it turns out that you have in fact caused Christian to pose a threat to me, then you could be liable to be killed in that case. But I don't think you can do this kind of moral causation thing that you mentioned. I don't know. Does Jonathan think you can do that?
I think.
I
don't want to quote Jonathan on. I'm not sure,
Okay.
but
I think maybe hold on to follow up. So we've got lots of people on
alright,
those,
sorry.
and don't ask them questions.
Sorry.
Sorry. And also, so fingers. I don't think we'll do fingers. Just save it. Everyone's on the list anyway, so just save it for when you're done. We'll know.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm trying to decide if you've made any revision to the account about bystanding, whether bystanders can be culpable that's in the book based on this discussion. So this Christian's discussion wanted to say it looks like the same sort of similar factors that ground culpability and threats can ground culpability for Alice as a bystander in terms of both the ability to do something, the failure to do that, and sort of the knowledge that she's not. And there are different ways. So carelessness, that's violation of sort of humanitarian duty, and that is culpable making. Sort of wanting the bad thing to happen, it seems like would be another way that you might want to say that Alice could be culpable. And then the controlling, your response about when she's a sort of controller, I'm not sure if that was supposed to be that you would consider her a threat in that case rather than bystander. So have you revised the account again in the book where you can't be culpable qua bystander when you say that you could be liable for having these kinds of attitudes, maybe you're not culpable qua bystander?
So I think what I want to say is still something like, look, she's not morally responsible for the fact that Vicky's life is in danger. She's not responsible for the threat, because there's kind of already a sufficient causal process endangering Vicky if we assume that Ella pulls the box out of the way. So I don't want to say that she's responsible for the fact that the victim's life is in danger, but I think that she can incur liability qua rescuer, right, or failed rescuer. So I'm not sure, but now I'm thinking, so when Christian was talking, I'm thinking, I'm not sure now how much will hang on this. I think so. Roughly, I need to think more about how we do this, and so in the book I distinguish between onlookers, so people who can just can do no good at all, and bystanders who are people who can make you better off by their presence, right? But they don't make you worse off by their presence. and it might be that, given that all of those people can make you better off by their presence, they're all sort of potential rescuers. It's just that sometimes, the only way they could rescue would be throw their body onto the track, and we think that's not required. But it might turn out then that if they're all potential rescuers, and then they can all fail, perhaps, then it could turn out that actually this distinction is less important than I thought. But I just need to think more about how to sort of think about these, cash these things out.
Alec. Oh, Christian, sorry, did you want to come in? You're able to come in whenever you want.
Okay, obviously you could have some bystanders who are actually not allowers, right? So there's allowing bystanders who are actually in a position to do something, and then there are bystanders who may be a benefit, but not through any voluntary action of theirs. They could simply be used to block the threat.
I was including them as because so it could be there's nothing
they're not
they
allowers,
can do.
no, they're not. They can't
Right, yeah.
prevent
So you
it.
could
Same
have people
effect.
like that, yeah. Okay, yeah.
So the quick wiggly finger that I don't think came on the table was what if Jonathan's other person threw another person on the track? Then it seems like he'd be a moral threat to you, and the person on the track is count. I don't want to go on that. That was my question. The question is really for Christian. Christian, I love everything in your presentation except one thing. And I want to push you, as I've done a couple times in the past, on this moral significance of enabling versus doing. But I'm going to push it slightly differently, because I think you made a nice point that you could try to cash it out in terms of ability to control, right, and how easy it is to perceive the possible problems. But that's obviously just sort of the enabling doing distinction is sort of a proxy for that.
Yeah, it's a contingent. It would be a contingent.
Right. And so, your cup example makes a nice case, right? Imagine you pick up the cup and a switch goes quick, and then some bomb blows up. You put down the cup, you flip a switch, bomb blows up, right? In one case, you're enabling, in another case, you're doing. But it seems like you can't carry it away, so why not just say, the difference is all about this other thing, and nothing about doing this?
Yeah. Yeah, so that would be a doing with an incredibly unlikely causal process, right? That would be just equally, yeah. So I'm tempted to go that way, to say that it's a contingent difference, but it's a pretty omnipresent difference, so that we treat all doings as different from all contributions as different from allowings. The differences between different modalities of contribution links to this contingent thing about ability to control. But there are some cases that I think are difficult that involve the difference between killing and preventing people from being saved, which I can't, which Jeff, for example, has presented to me before, and I find it very difficult to, even controlling for all those things, not see a difference between those cases.
So the idea of someone who throws somebody else in the track. So I think you can. So I think in that case, if Mike throws somebody else's body onto the track, then I could kill Mike, use him as a human shield, something to block the trolley. So I think it's perfectly possible for there to be that kind of adding weight, right? Because when the people who are on the track are there sort of non-responsibly, it doesn't really matter how they got there, right? Because often we think of a variation of the case where a villain has tied them to the tracks. The thought is that I can't, by sort of voluntarily getting onto the track, alter the proportionality calculation, because the harms that are relevant to a proportionality calculation and lesser evil justification are the unavoidable harms, right? It's the thought.
Okay. One tiny little thing I just want to come back to. So the biggest difference I see between the categories of the doing intuitively is when what the agent is doing is enabling harm to save a greater number versus doing harm to do a greater number. And this is even if the situation is transparent, right? So if you have like a case like this, and interposing this rock here will sort of, removing this rock here to place it over here will block another cart from killing 5 people. That seems clearly justifiable, right? Whereas, pushing a cart down so that it slams into Vicky as a means of preventing a cart from going down and hitting 5 people doesn't seem obviously justifiable.
Zach?
So I'm very sympathetic to your thought here, Christian. But I wonder whether you are trying to make a kind of evidence relative morality argument rather than factual morality. Meaning, since usually the enabler does not have to take so many facts into consideration, he's more protected than the good or something like that. But once everything is transparent, you cannot really make this distinction.
Right. So I was imagining that there would probably be different standards of care involved in different types of action to begin with, right? So when
if you know in advance the consequences of
yeah,
doing,
I agree. In fully transparent situations, I do find it very difficult to see the difference in many cases. Although there are others where, like one I just mentioned, where if it's fully transparent, the modality of the way in which I'm contributing to the harm of one person through enabling or doing seems to make a difference intuitively to me. But I do agree that there are many cases where if it's transparent, but then there are going to be different levels of care that you have to exercise if you're removing things from spaces versus pushing things into spaces just because of characters. But we're imagining that even if we've done those extra precautions involved in this, as opposed to this, so that we act permissibly in both cases, there's still some sort of residual difference in terms of the costs we have to take on to prevent the harm from occurring.
Isn't removing something from one space putting it into another?
Well, it is. The different ways of removing things from space, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not on the list. Mitt. Mitt.
Oh, actually, you took that's a question about it.
Oh, good for you. Okay.
I'm just saying to Christian, this is a really elegant way of conveying a lot of information. So maybe in the second edition of your book, you might think about doing pictures.
I think listen, we need to have some ground rules here. Not too many compliments, please. Let's keep it hostile. That's right. More fuck off. Joe.
Oh, well, I was going to offer another example of a case in which I thought it seems intuitively plausible to suppose that somebody is morally liable to be harmed as a side effect, but not morally liable to be limited,ly and even more implausible to suppose that the same person would be liable to be harmed opportunistically. But I thought Christian's example of using malice as a shield was good enough, and if that doesn't work, I don't know what will. So I wanted to come back to something that Helen said in response to Christian, because it raised an issue that I mentioned yesterday, and I'm just puzzled about this. When you were responding to Christian, you said that a person can have a duty to bear a harm, but isn't liable, and by that you mean hasn't forfeited the right not to suffer the harm. I'm just wondering about how that's consistent. That is, if a person has a duty to bear a harm, and that duty is enforceable, it seems to me that it must be the case that that person lacks a right not to be caused that harm. Because you're saying it's permissible for somebody to enforce the duty to bear the harm, namely permissible for the person to impose the harm, and presumably this isn't lesser evil because you're saying the person's got a duty to take it, so that can't be the justification. So it looks to me, this is what I was saying yesterday, as if the idea that a person has a duty to bear a harm and the duty is enforceable, really it just turns out to be substantively equivalent to the notion that the person is liable to bear the harm and really doesn't have a right.
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking about since you sent me comments for the book review, and I wasn't quite getting Kim's point at first, so I think this is right, actually. So I think it might be the case that actually, so it might turn out to be a sort of terminological difference, that I just think that it can be useful to restrict the label of liability to capture a particular phenomenon, namely when somebody has forfeited their rights by behaving in a particular way, right? So I'm just trying to talk about liability. When I talk about liability, that's what I mean. There can be other ways in which people can come to lose rights, I think, or lack rights. And I think that cases in which someone has a duty to bear the harm but hasn't forfeited their rights, they just perhaps never lacked rights, never had a right against this harm in the first place, or whatever, then we shouldn't extend liability, because then it just gives liability these different meanings, and the term's going to become less useful if we have it play these roles. But I do think that, as you say, it might turn out that substantively these things are the same. And so, yeah, so this is something that I need to think more about, is whether or not. So my view has been that you have to be morally responsible to be liable, but it might turn out that actually this is a case in which whether you're liable or you have the duty, it just seems like they're the same.
It does look like the person in the case who has the enforceable duty has lost the right rather than never having had it in the first place.
place. So it does look like, I mean, you might want to distinguish between loss and forfeiture. You say forfeiture is a result of something that you've done for which you're responsible, and there can be loss without forfeiture, which has an independent notion of loss, but that would be true in the cases of non-responsible threateners who have had the right not, let's say, to be killed, but then wind up in the situation.
I mean, this could turn out not to be a terribly interesting sort of. I mean, it could be something like, look, you never had a right not to be killed when you were about to kill someone else. So
then you just have Kai's view, and the notion of liability ceases to have any role in your.
right.
Or it's a notion that's kind of implicit in the kind of view that Kai defends in his book, but it's just a completely different way of describing our rights. All the exceptions are built into the right.
yeah, and all I can really say is I need to think more about what differences there would be if we have these different ways of doing it.
So you've all been very impressively brief in your questions and answers. So we did start 10 minutes late, so we have 12 minutes left and I have 2 people on the list. So I can take fingers now, and if people are missing, if anyone wants to put another hand up and have another go, they should say now so I know how many fingers I can take. But in the meantime, okay. And Victor.
Am I on the list?
Kai, you weren't on the list. So. Okay.
You looked at me, nodded.
I looked at Alison. Yeah, no, I believe you. I don't think like, okay, Kai, good, okay. So Victor, just have a quick finger on this.
So in your exchange, you were debating about whether having a duty that was enforceable justice being liable. And then I thought that the right thing to say is that having the duty and fulfilling certain conditions of enforceability is an explanation why a person might lose certain rights. It's not what it is to lose a right is having certain kinds of claims you might have on other people and so on, and then the fact that you have certain kinds of duties and have certain entities provides part of the explanation why. And that leaves open the possibility of other kinds of explanations why, but this is one kind of explanation why. That's how I think.
Okay.
It's not terminological here, it's
Right.
trying to get an underlying explanation.
Okay, maybe we can talk more about that afterwards.
Okay. Kai next.
Yeah, I analyze these kinds of cases in terms of rights, and of course, for liability, you require a threat to a right. And I think you just think in terms of rights and the stringency of rights, a lot of these cases make a lot of sense. I mean, one reason we're maybe worried about assigning liability to Alice is because we're maybe not be uncertain about whether we have these rights to positive aid from other people, and Alice, you're rescuing, there have to be a positive right against Alice that should be threatened by not moving the box in front. And so, the culpability there isn't enough. There's still to be a threat to right, because I might be culpable for buying an $80 dinner and not sending the money to save starving people, but you couldn't kill me to save the starving people, presumably in spite of my culpability. I'm to blame for it. I'm cold-hearted in that way, right? Because I would, again, assuming common sense use of this is correct, I wouldn't be threatening the right of the starving people by not using the $80 to send them food. And also, that makes Ollie and Alice seem very similar to me, because I see Ollie as having, if there's a right that he's threatening by not moving, it's a positive right against him that he not move out of the way and rescue, essentially, Vicky. And then in the Ella case, I think a lot of it depends on rights. I think suppose Vicky put that box there, it's her property, she built it out of unknown world resources, and because she was worried about the possibility of Dirk sending that card down towards her. And then now Ella goes to remove the box, there I think she's got to be just like Dirk. There's no difference there, because she's acting on something to which Vicky has a right in the way that threatens her life, just like Dirk is threatening to act on something to which Vicky has a right, namely Vicky's own body, right? In a way that threatens Vicky's life. On the other hand, if it's Ella's box, I think, if it's Vicky's box, if Vicky could kill Ella to save her own life, if necessary. But if it's Ella's box, say Ella needs the box to save her own life, right? Vicky couldn't kill Ella. So who has the right to the box it's going to have a big impact on these cases. But I'll stop there. Those are some examples of the relevance of looking at it that way.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I think I agree with that somewhat. I have some worries about the way so there's the kind of the account of how property rights might factor into permissible killing that I'm most familiar with is John Kwong's account, and I think there are some worries about this idea of how certainly how John thinks about our ownership rights and what we get to do with our property, and how these kind of can affect what is permissible to do and who it's permissible for us to harm. I share the intuition, I think, in this case, and yesterday when we were talking about the medical resources, right, it seems to matter if it's my heart medication as opposed to just in the pharmacy. So I share the intuition, but I'm not sure how much weight I want to place on ownership rights. It's just something I haven't thought that much about, other than being sceptical of how. I can see that there seem to be quite worrying implications of how John does this, but that might not be true of your account, so I'm going to read your book.
Two different ways. With the removal case, if it's Ella's box, you could say that it at least makes a difference in that the destruction of the box, if the box would be destroyed or something like that, that would count on the cost to Ella if it's hers, in a way that it wouldn't if it's not hers. That would be the minimal sense in which it could make a difference. And then another sense to make a difference is that because she's entitled to it, it just changes completely the valence of the case so that she has.
Adel.
Question for Christian. So for you, what is the difference between culpability and, say, knowingly failing to take a morally required cost?
Say the first thing?
So what is the difference between culpability? So for Alice.
Okay.
So what is the difference between saying that Alice is culpable and saying that she's knowingly fails to take the morally required cost?
Well, there's not, certainly knowingly failing to take the required cost is sufficient for culpability. It may not be necessary because she may not know, but she should have known, and she could still be culpable to some degree.
Okay, so culpability is just about her mental state with respect to the failure to take the morally required cost.
Well, I would say that her ignorance is not a mental state. But yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Mike Skaka?
Yeah, thanks. I want to talk about your broad definition of killing. And in what I'm about to say, I want to clarify that by intention, I mean the mental event aiming at an action or guiding an action, as opposed to the end that you want to bring about. Okay? So I accept your argument, agree with it, about the equivalency between shielding and holding the flagpole.
Okay.
Holding the shield and holding the flagpole. I disagree respectfully with your conflation.
It doesn't have to be respectful. Nobody else is respectful.
I didn't even process this.
Respectfully, fuck off.
So I don't see why you render equivalent flagpole with ray gun. And
I'm sorry, could you say that?
Yeah. Recenter.
Yeah, sorry.
So I accept shielding equals flagpole, but I don't accept that flagpole equals ray gun.
Okay.
Okay, here's why. Here's the difference. I want to see why you don't think it's a difference.
Okay.
That with the shielding, if I'm the victim, I can survive if the falling man bounces off the shield and survives.
Mm-hmm.
All I have to do is all I have to do is intend to shield myself, adjusting the shield to cover my body. And if he survives, awesome. But with ray gun, I have to intend to kill him. The only way I live is if he dies. And so if I miss or I'm misfired, I need to keep shooting and keep re-aiming until he's burned first. So in my world, that difference of intention makes two actions morally different. One you can call shielding, and one is killing. And since he's an innocent guy, I would say that's murder, albeit under duress. So I want to know, why do you not see a substantive difference between shielding and killing?
So I'm not sure there's a difference between, well, two things. So I'm not sure there's a significant difference between needing somebody. I mean, well, okay, so maybe better just say that it's not clear that I need him dead in the vaporization case. So I'd be super happy, right, if the falling fat guy was able to reconstitute himself, right? I mean, that'd be awesome, and I'd be very happy for both of us. but he can't, and that's sad, right? But
You don't sound very sad.
I'm respectfully sad. So it just seems like, so in the shield case, I mean, look, I think that, and this is something I talk about in the book, and maybe this is sort of one way of trying to get at the idea that the shield seems kind of defensive, and it's not like you're really trying to hurt this person, you're just trying to protect yourself, and you'd be really happy if they survive. You don't need them dead. But you don't need them dead, really, in the vaporization case, right? You just need them not there. And if they can reappear elsewhere, fully functioning, right, then that's cool too. So it's sort of, but the problem is, of course, you can't, it's just really implausible to think that if you vaporize someone, they can put themselves back together. But it's still, I can still have the same mental attitude, right? It can still be that my attitude towards this person is it would be really great if they can survive this, and I'm really rooting for that, that's great. But it turns out they can't, and this could be equally true in the shield case. I'm really hoping they hit it at such an angle that they're not killed. I don't need them to be dead, that's of no benefit to me. I just need them not to hit me. So I think this isn't going to work as a way of trying to distinguish these cases.
With respect,
Very quickly. Respectfully. No, that's fine, but a little
it just
As
seems
you were
weaselly.
respect.
It just seems weaselly. Wilkins makes a similar argument.
That's the spirit.
That's bullshit.
I would like to vaporize him, but not kill him.
But to me it sounds equally weaselly to say, look, you're going to use the shield, you know that when he hits the shield it's going to kill him, right? It's, falling from this high, hitting a solid object, it's going to kill him. The fact that, you'd be happy with the theoretical possibility that he could bounce at just the right angle that he doesn't die, that's pretty weaselly, right? Saying, look, it would have been great if you sort of, say there's one sort of tiny sort of possibility that he might just hit it in the right way that it doesn't kill him. I think it's just as weaselly. What's
wrong with weasels, I want to know. Anyway, so can we do
You're not
last?
on the list.
Can we do a last?
Yeah,
last
sorry.
question?
Yeah.
So Kim's got a last, a very small finger on this, and then a last question from Simon.
Okay, so 2 quick points. There's a great thing on intentions and when side effects are too connected. It's this paper by Infers and called Beyond Intention. That's not the point. The point is, I think it's a mistake to actually let your definition of causatives, like when you're going to cause something a killing, compared to when it's a causing death. Like if you think there's a distinction from that, that distinction does not turn on intentions. So if I take a gun and I don't even realize it's a gun and I fire it and I kill someone, we call it a killing because of the causal relation, irrespective of my intention vis-a-vis the end. So it's just a mistake to let this intention knowledge distinction that you're using in shield versus ray gun track whether or not you think there's moral significance in calling something a killing versus a causing death. I don't think there's moral significance in the other two, but I think it's a mistake to think that intention is going to do the work of when we call it killing.
And that's okay, Simon Connor?
I was just, you might not be surprised to learn that I was trying to conceptualise some of your arguments in light of your conclusions about attacking the Red Cross. Spent 7 years just doing that, so I'm glad I mentioned that. Well, no, I spent some time before that ago. Spent 7 years preventing being attacked. Because a significant debate now is about the protection of healthcare in that field. And I wonder a little bit in the context of Christian's remarks about the maturation of threat, how that plays out in your context of, and if I understand your argument right, the issue about targeting the Red Cross is related to their capacity to enable the treatment of unjust combatants who may then subsequently return to the battlefield and cause harm to just combatants. Okay? And I just wonder a little bit about this question of how the maturation of the threat, and I think that wasn't quite your phrase for it, Christian, but that's I think what you were talking about, plays out when you're talking about failure to do what you're obliged to do in order to avert the threat. Because that would then seem paradoxical if you have obligations to treat injured parties, but then by having an obligation to treat them, you're making yourself liable to be attacked from virtue of feeling that obligation to treat them. So that doesn't avert, that in fact enables a future threat.
So last word from Helen, and if you want to, Christian.
Just quick clarification. So, on my view, it wouldn't be the capacity; it's whether or not they're actually contributing to unjust threats. And I'm not quite sure I see the maturation of threat thought. I mean, on my view, it couldn't be the case that there's an obligation to treat somebody that's going to go on to pose an unjust threat. Because on my view, you're obliged not to treat that person, right? That's the point. That's the ground of the liability in these cases. So. And Red Cross here is just a placeholder. Yeah. People playing this kind of role, right? So you're not going to get that tension on my view. It couldn't be the case that you were both obliged to treat the guy and not obliged, right? If he's going to go on to pose unjust threats, then you shouldn't treat him.
My last word is just to introduce another friend named Iggy, who's an enabler by interposing. Something that will block the threat, and that's another thing that we need to think about, right? So in the case where this is coming down towards Vicky, this card is coming and it will intercept it, but Iggy puts this here and it intercepts the intercepting card. Does that count as direct? So that also leads to direct. Where on your...
You can't just blow everyone's mind at the last thing of the session.
I didn't know I had the last word. You gave it, and I gave it to you.
You're going to drop the mic now.
I didn't know I had the last word.
All right, let's thank the judge for that. So we'll start again at 10:02.
I can't wait to read.
At 10:02.
That was great. Yeah, that's really, really good. Yeah, I can't wait to read the paper. I think it's going to be really.
Okay, that'll be fun.
Yeah, really helpful.
He's obstructed.
Jesus
Christ.
Okay. Oh, right.
Okay,
well, these big Jewish guys.